Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video I want to talk some about the legendary Robert Duvall, who recently passed away at the age of 95. Duvall is one of the most celebrated and beloved of actors of his generation, and was a good friend of many of his contemporaries, such as Gene Hackman. Like Hackman, Duvall had an ability to have an indefinable range. He could play virtually any type of role and any size of role. He was effortlessly able to transition between character parts and lead roles and go back and forth. And like others of his generation, he was able to hone his craft on both the stage and the small screen in many fantastic television dramas and other performances. So by the time he came to feature films in the early 1960s, he was able to play virtually any type of part that was thrown at him. But of course, these would typically be small parts. And his first role was, of course, as Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962, which is, in terms of the screen time, a very small part and, practically wordless. But that character is so important that you need a strong actor in that role, otherwise the entire final act of the movie falls apart and the overall impact of the movie is diluted greatly. And Duvall then and there was able to display his incredible presence on screen and his ability to essentially dial into the character so perfectly that the distinction between actor and character was not something the audience was making. You simply believed in the character on screen. And for me personally, what I've always enjoyed and loved about Duvall's performances is his ability to not just get across that characterization fully, but to live in each individual moment, which was apparently his acting philosophy of finding the truth in each and every scene and not actually getting ahead of that particular moment, of having each moment be a moment in time because you're playing a character who is living those individual moments. So to go before or beyond that means you're not actually living the scene. And he also had this incredible ability to play within his eyes. There was always this spark, whether he was playing a lovable character, a character with great intelligence, an absolute rogue, or even a villain. He could do so much with merely a look or his gaze and project such emotion. And so that's why I think he was so ideally suited to Boo Radley, but most especially playing the nearly wordless character THX in THX 1138. There's not really any other actor you can think of who could have pulled off that role to that degree of success. And this is something Duvall would do time and time again. It was his particular strength that he brought to every role he ever played. And the reason why he's one of the great screen actors is not just his incredible longevity, his devotion to the craft, but as with any great actor, I think the mark of distinction is never having a false note in a performance, no matter how big or how small. That's the mark of a truly great actor. It doesn't matter what medium it is or what form it is. The greats do not ever let the mask slip, in a sense, or let the audience see behind the curtain or see the performance. You never see Duvall actually performing. You merely see the character reacting and making decisions in those moments in time. And you always get the sense that it was the project, the material that mattered more than the size of the role. It was the story itself, and did it particularly grab him as an actor, in terms of reading script after script or project after project. So he could even do things such as more comedic roles or poke fun at his own screen image or venture into satire, always with the ability to sort of straddle between all genres and, again, always serve the material by playing the character in that point in time. And so his performances typically weren't as flashy in some of the more famous films that he was in. And so in some of the most iconic films, such as The Godfather, I think there's a tendency for his performances to be a bit overlooked, especially in The Godfather when you have everyone swinging for the fences and you've got Brando and Pacino and James Caan and the rest of the iconic cast. But Tom Hagen as a character is really the glue of the Corleone family, and has all of the additional layers of being the adopted son and not being Italian and having to deal with all of that, and how he was raised in a particular way and how he thinks differently from everyone else. And of the sons of Don Vito Corleone, he is the most grounded, but yet not being Italian can never be fully accepted, and also is an outsider no matter how hard he tries. It's an incredibly nuanced and difficult character to play. And because the character typically has to be quiet or appear in even famous scenes and not really have anything to do in terms of what's on the script page and dialogue, it means you have to work even harder. You have to use every single moment, but you can't do it at the expense of the character or those moments. It is a masterclass in how to deal with being in the middle of such larger-than-life characters as an actor and not getting lost in the shuffle. This is, of course, something Duvall would do again in the iconic Network, where his executive character is really what accelerates and continues the story and allows for the acts to develop, because his character signing off on things and getting basically sucked up into the Howard Beale program and the machinations of the Faye Dunaway character, it's his performance that is the linchpin or the foundation, that the fulcrum that the whole plot swings on, and even the ending is motivated by his character. So it's a smaller role technically. It's not as bigger than life as Peter Finch's performance, nor is it the heart of the film like William Holden's performance is, but the Duvall performance is what creates the ability for the film to work. If you didn't have somebody in Network in that particular part who could play serious, but it was also a character that you couldn't quite get a read on. You could read him in different ways. And if you had somebody who couldn't hit all of those layers, it wouldn't work in the same way that it needs to in order to have the inherent satire of the television industry and American pop culture and the actual darkness of the drama. You know, all those elements, it's very delicately balanced. It's a house of cards, and without that key central figure and without Duvall's performance being as finely nuanced and focused as it is, the whole thing would not work and you would potentially collapse. Of course, like the other greats of his generation, Duvall did not immediately come to stardom. It was something that he really had to work at. And if you look at his early filmography, he was basically stuck playing bit parts and even got into some iconic films, but sometimes you wouldn't even quite realize it. For example, he's in the iconic Bullitt, but his part is essentially that of a cab driver. So you eventually realize, hey, that's Robert Duvall. He's in Bullitt. But that was the extent of some of his credits, really, until getting True Grit in 1969, where he's immediately able to show that other side he could very easily dip into if needed. And then he essentially wound up hooking up with what would become the American Zoetrope crew and doing The Rain People with Francis Ford Coppola and a young George Lucas, which led him to getting in THX 1138, which again, I think is the role where you get the greatest degree of his ability for silent emoting. I think he would have made a brilliant silent film actor, actually, which is a distinction that very few have after the end of the silent period. But if you look at THX and what he's able to do in that film, playing a character in a futuristic society where all emotions are repressed and it's all about the dehumanization of life itself, it is an extraordinarily complex film that was not understood by the audiences or its original studio, Warner Brothers, on its original release. But it is a role that doesn't really give the actor much to do on the page. It means that they have to inform every scene themselves, and they have to do it typically without much dialogue, and what dialogue they do have is supposed to be minimal and controlled and emotionless. So how do you suggest and build the awakening of the human spirit in a character who has been systematically broken down and closed off and shut down for their entire lives by a society that does that to everyone? every human being. After The Godfather, his career really took off, and that's when you started seeing films where he would have substantial roles or even start to get the co-lead or the lead role. So he's quite memorable in Joe Kidd, and especially in The Outfit, which is a very gritty 1970s adaptation of one of the Parker novels. In 1974, he did both of Coppola's films that year. He has a small but pivotal role in The Conversation, where he's at his most evasive and yet oddly chilling in a way. And then also, of course, reprising his role as Tom Hagen in The Godfather Part 2, where again, he is the character who is essentially stuck between all fronts of the Corleone family empire that has developed further, but is in danger of fraying at all ends. And you really get the sense of his character turmoil throughout the entire film in a performance that builds and grows from what he did in the first film. In 1975, he worked for director Sam Peckinpah in The Killer Elite, opposite James Caan again, in a role that was opposite of his traditional image. He plays more of the villain role, and while the film itself has its fair share of issues, it remains very striking for certain elements and the grittier edge that even a more commercially minded action film in the mid-70s still would have. 1976 would see him in an all-star cast in the John Sturges version of The Eagle Has Landed, where he plays a German intelligence officer in a daring attempt to strike against the Allies in World War II. Then he wound up playing a very good version of Dr. Watson in the film adaptation of Nicholas Meyer's fantastic Holmes novel, The 7% Solution. Then, of course, comes his incredibly important and striking role in Network as the executive Frank Hackett in a film that has not only one of the great ensemble casts, it is one of the great satires of films, is one of the great films of Sidney Lumet's legendary career, but also the legendary work of Paddy Chayefsky and his incredible script for the film. 1979, I think, is a pivotal year as well, because you have one of his most iconic performances as Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now, which again is a very small role in terms of the actual amount of screen time, but it is so burned into everyone's brains who ever see the film that doesn't matter, and his dialogue has entered into the pop culture lexicon forever. And it is a character that on the page seems very silly because he is obsessed with surfing. And of course, we got the iconic lines like Charlie Don't Surf. But on the flip side of that, when you get to the iconic I love the smell of napalm in the morning sequence, it is right there on that edge of perhaps almost dipping into a Dr. Strangelove type satire, which is how Apocalypse Now started in terms of the original John Milius version that was developed for George Lucas to make. But the grounding in reality of that scene and the way that Duvall plays it, and of course he's shirtless, but he still has the big cowboy hat on, it is right there on that edge and is thus believable that a character would do and say something like that in that situation in the middle of all this carnage. And thus it makes the scene unbelievably chilling, and it's something you never forget. And the way he delivers those iconic lines is not in a showy way, and he's not yelling it. He's having to speak over the noise of the carnage and the madness around them. But he's saying it with such conviction, and then he even, gets down on a knee, and it's almost like some staged version of a military commander giving some sort of impromptu speech to motivate his men to go further. But it's almost like something that is so crazy it has to be true. That's the sort of feeling that the audience gets along with Martin Sheen's Willard in that scene. And that's why that sequence is so iconic. That's why that scene has entered the pop culture lexicon. That's why everyone knows I love the smell of napalm in the morning, even if they've never seen Apocalypse Now. But the moment that sells that scene and underlines everything isn't the famous line. It's the line that comes just after that, where he reflects for a second and he says, it smells like victory. And that says everything about that character in a single sentence, and it's not even the most famous line of that speech. Duvall's other film that year is, of course, The Great Santini, which is an intensive character drama about a Marine who isn't really the most lovable father figure for his family, as is quite obvious for anyone who's seen the film. It's a film that obviously is not commercially minded. It's a character piece where the lead actor is not afraid to have himself look bad, which is something that most stars, especially at the time, were not really fond of doing or simply wouldn't do. I think this is the film that really shows where Duvall's heart lie as an actor, and thus a lot of the projects he would choose after this in terms of where his career would go, I think really branch from this point. Because after this, everything from Tender Mercies to his performance in The Natural, all the stuff throughout the 80s and 90s, including a lot of the films that he would either produce or even some of the films that he would write and direct, I think it always shows that attention to choosing the meaty role, and the size didn't matter. It was the story itself, the material, the themes, what it was actually saying, and what it gave him to do. So it didn't matter if it was a drama or a comedy or a character piece, or if the role wasn't big and flashy. It was all about the material and the character. 1983 saw Tender Mercies, where Robert Duvall finally won a long overdue Best Actor Oscar in a film where he played essentially an alcoholic, washed-up country singer, and he so threw himself into the role, as he always did, that many on the set didn't know where the character started and the actor began, and he even learned how to sing, which is something, again, most actors are not willing to do in a role like that. I think the next truly pivotal role is, of course, 1989's Lonesome Dove, which is the miniseries adapted from Larry McMurtry's novel, which originally began life as a planned film project to have a sort of final hurrah for the great Western stars and bring together Henry Fonda, John Wayne, and Jimmy Stewart. And so essentially in this beloved miniseries, you get the fully fleshed out filmed version, as it's able to have the longer scope than what you could get in a single feature film. And again, Robert Duvall is able to completely inhabit the character of Gus McCrae to such a degree that the line between actor and character no longer exists. And this is a completely unique character, even in Duvall's own filmography. All his performances are. But Gus McCrae is not your typical Western star hero or even your typical Western character. He is a unique, fun, intelligent man of the earth who is also the energy that drives the story along. Because the character of Woodrow Call, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who's the other main star of Lonesome Dove, is very reserved and closed off. So it's left to Duvall's performance to be the energy that drives the majority of the miniseries along. And it's the interactions between the two that is really the highlight and what everybody loves to remember, and what makes the overall story so rich and textured that by its end there is true poignancy achieved. And it's such a multifaceted performance that it's impossible to think of anybody else playing this role and being able to make it so seamless and so textured and believable that you wish you could just watch another 4 hours just of this character. Throughout the rest of his career, Duvall would balance between personal projects, more independently minded films, character dramas, with the bigger budget films to keep his name bankable and to have a presence in summer tentpoles. So, for example, he appears in Days of Thunder, which is clearly a reworking of the film Top Gun and the same formula, just now in the NASCAR circuit. But I've always felt Days of Thunder is a stronger film because it has more story development, and crucially, the relationship between the Robert Duvall and Tom Cruise characters is extremely rewarding because of the way they're able to play off of each other. And this would happen once again when Robert Duvall had the smaller part in the first Jack Reacher film that Tom Cruise starred in, where he made the entire film better and walked off with the whole film just having a small part. And just having the two of them interacting on screen again was a real treat and the highlight of that entire film. His His performances would continue to vary, and again, he really proved time and time again that he was an actor's actor because the material and the character was always the most important. It didn't matter the size or what type of film it was. So he would even take roles such as his performance in Geronimo, an American Legend, which is a truly underrated film that Walter Hill made, which features fantastic performances by legends, but typically in smaller parts as part of an ensemble. It would also go on to even write, direct, and star in The Apostle in 1997 and continue to have truly fantastic appearances and all sorts of films, ranging from even Deep Impact to even the remake of Gone in 60 Seconds. He even was able to acknowledge his advancing years in certain roles, such as the 2009 film Get Low, so his appearances naturally started to slow down, but even that didn't deter him from seeking out projects that he wanted to do. And it also added an extra poignancy to his screen appearances because every time he appeared in something new, you knew that it at least had that extra level of having one of the screen legends take a part in a particular film. And even in smaller parts, he could still walk off with the entire film, such as in the first Jack Reacher film. Another highlight for me is, of course, 2003's Open Range, where he is truly spectacular paired with Kevin Costner in one of the only truly good modern westerns. And of course, Duvall is playing a completely unique character specifically for this particular story. A lot of actors might feel that, if they've already played an iconic Western character in a film, they might revisit some of those elements in a performance, but Duvall was not one for that. And then he also made the excellent television miniseries Broken Trail, again with Walter Hill, so he had several really fantastic Western credits in his later career. Ultimately, Robert Duvall was one of those faces you saw on the screen and were delighted every time you saw him appear, because you knew, as with any of the great performers, you were getting your money's worth as a paying audience member. You knew that this was someone who showed up time and time again and was completely dialed into everything they were doing and was a consummate professional with such a level of humanity and intelligence in each performance, even without dialogue. Again, I would say that for me, Duvall's great ability of being able to emote with just his eyes and just say volumes without any words has always been what has drawn my eyes towards him in any film. And his craft was so intricate that, again, he was never flashy unless the role of the character called for that. He could bring the energy when it was called for, and thus it made the scenes hit hard as they were supposed to and made the characters feel all the more real. And his range was such that there was virtually no role that he couldn't approach and tackle perfectly, from even the most cold-hearted villain to even the emotionally repressed, nearly silent character of THX. So I've always admired and respected Duvall's craft and his incredible filmography. He was truly one of the great actors of his generation, and thus one of the great screen actors of all time. And he bridged several generations over an incredible body of work that hopefully everybody will revisit and recognize his absolute artistry. That's certainly what I'm going to be doing, and that's why I've decided to say a few words in this video. The first film I'm going to revisit is actually The Apostle, which I haven't seen in a good number of years, and it seems to have been a very close project for Duvall, since he was the executive producer, he was the star, but he also wrote and directed it. So I just wanted to say a few words about the passing of one of our great actors and someone who I have respected and admired for virtually my entire film-going life. So please do take the time to study and respect the incredible body of work that Robert Duvall leaves behind, and hopefully discover some new favorites of your own. And so I'd like to say, as always, thank you ever so much for watching.